Hello and greetings. This is the second part of the interview I conduct with Bhattacharya. We had just changed roles. He interviewed me, and I'm very happy that you still have the times to answer some questions to me, because it would be a pity to lose this time that I have with you. Maybe for my audience, I think I don't need to present you very long, but just some facts about you. You are an epidemiologist and professor of medicine, economics and health, research policy at medical school at Stanford University, and you became famous in 2020 when you opposed the lockdowns and mask mandates and published together with your colleagues Martin Kulldorff and Sunitra Gupta from Oxford University the Great Barrington Declaration, which advocated for lifting the COVID-19 restrictions on lower risk groups to develop herd immunity while protecting vulnerable people. And you were smeared by Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the World Health Organization, for this declaration, which in itself is a badge of honor. And there is one more badge of honor that you got, because you were part of the Twitter files release. You were one of the persons that were censored, right, when you posted your first post on the platform, which was in August 2021, and your name appeared on a trends blacklist, which means that your tweets were kind of prevented from showing up in trending topics. So I think from today's perspective, you and your colleagues were just right. And this was why you were targeted so harshly by the political mainstream at that point in time. And to ask you some questions right to begin with, I wanted to ask you a super standard question, maybe, that you always heard. What was a key moment, or the key moment that made you critical of the corona measures?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me and talking with me. As you summarized what I went through during the pandemic, I'm getting a little bit of post-traumatic stress disorder just thinking about it. It was quite shocking. I'll tell you, it's actually from the very earliest days of the pandemic, I thought that the narrative was wrong. I had a hypothesis in March of 2020 that the disease had already spread fairly widely, and to test that hypothesis, I conducted a study asking how many people in California had already had COVID in early April of 2020. And it turned out it's about 3 or 4%, which doesn't sound like a big number, but it was 50, for every person that had been identified as a case and went to the hospital with COVID, there were 50 people walking around California that had antibodies to COVID. And most of them, 40% of them, many of them didn't even remember getting sick. So it was after I conducted that study, I realized that the lockdowns that had already been in place for a couple of weeks had failed to protect, 3 or 4% of the population. That's a big chunk of the population that the lockdowns had failed to protect. I'd already seen the evidence that the lockdowns were harming people around the world. The economic dislocations caused by the lockdowns, especially the poor, especially the vulnerable, working class people. And so that's roughly around that time frame. Early March is when I had the hypothesis, and then April when the study, I completed those studies, I realized that was that we really needed a very different path to managing COVID.
And the country which was closest to what you recommended, I guess, was Sweden, although they failed to protect the elderly in the beginning as well, right? Is that right?
Yeah. So the Swedish response. It's unfortunate that very early on in Stockholm, they made the same mistake that for instance, in New York, Andrew Cuomo, the governor, made. They decided in Stockholm that they were going to. They failed to protect the nursing homes in Stockholm, the care centers and care homes in Stockholm, where older people were, and so you had some high death rates, I think, in Stockholm early in the pandemic in Sweden. But in large part, the Swedish response, which was a response that recognized the epidemiology of the disease, which is that the oldest people were the most vulnerable, younger people were at much lower risk. That response was a model response. It also emphasized the uncertainty in the data when it was there, so that there wasn't an overstating what the evidence was, but it also included advice for older people, for controlling the risk to older people. It was a much more humane response. And in particular, the Swedish health authorities never closed schools for kids 16 and under, never forced the closing of schools for 16 and under. And as a result, the children there had no learning loss, none of the sort of psychological harms that have come from the school closures in so many other places in the world. And they studied very carefully what impact it had on the disease spread, and compared for instance, there was a study where the Swedish health authorities compared themselves to Finland, which had closed schools early in 2020, in mid 2020, and found that the school closures had not had any significant impact on the spread of the disease. So the Swedish health authority, I think, did an incredible job in a very difficult circumstance, both balancing the risk from the disease, recognizing the epidemiology of who actually was at risk, against the social harms from the measures that they were imposing or suggesting. And as a result, they have the lowest all-cause excess deaths in Europe. They protected human life over the course of the pandemic better than other countries, even compared to Finland, even compared to Norway, and even compared to Germany. They protected human life better without lockdowns.
I remember that Sweden was smeared in Germany in the same way that you were, for example, because today, for example, I read an article from our science journalist Christina Berndt again about your Great Barrington Declaration when it came out. And it was really funny how right they felt and how bad you were with your ideas. And now, retrospectively, Sweden was right, and I think you were right. But, for example, I wondered that this year, your standing for scientific truth had consequences for one of your team members, which was Martin Kulldorff, who was fired from Harvard. And I wanted to ask you if you faced similar pressure. Maybe you can't talk about it, I don't know, but by your institution and how that turned out.
No, I've written about it. In 2020, I almost lost my job at Stanford. Because I conducted that study, there was they called it a fact finding. I published 160, 170 studies in my career. Never had anything like this, where the university was based on a false hit piece done by BuzzFeed News, decided to do a fact finding with these looking into false allegations about conflicts of interest and so on. They ultimately concluded I'd done nothing, but it was tremendously stressful. I thought, I could have lost my job if they'd found something. In 2021. 100 of my colleagues circulated a secret petition. 2 of my friends leaked it to me, in effect asking the president of the university to silence me. And my crime was that I had noticed and told the public that there was no high-quality evidence on masking children, on the efficacy of masking children and preventing COVID. None. Still to this day, there are no randomized studies of masking children at all. And in the United States, unlike Germany, which actually I think had a slightly more rational policy, the U.S. CDC recommended masking children as young as 2 years old. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And on the basis of no evidence. Because I said this in talking to Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, who was also vilified, my 100 of my colleagues, including people I've written papers with and some of whom I'm friends with, signed a petition trying to get me silenced by the president of the university. I'm still quite shocked by this. I never anticipated a university which is supposed to host discussions and debates on the most important issues of the day that they would react in this way, especially to me, since I've been a member of the faculty here almost for 25 years.
Yes, I can imagine. And do you still feel the pressure, or is there a certain rehabilitation process going on, so to say?
Well, I think Stanford in particular has changed quite a bit since 2020. And we have a new president. Actually, he's the president of a man named John Levin, who seems very committed to academic freedom. much more so than the previous president. Just as concretely, I'm going to have a conference that I've organized on October 4th at Stanford this year, where it'll, for the first time in a major university, feature civil discussions between people who differed on the optimal COVID policy by prominent scientists, including Anders Tegnell will be at the conference from the Swedish Health Authority. He's going to be sitting on a panel on evidence-based decision making during a pandemic. I mean, it should be very, very interesting. Yet the striking thing is that the university, despite attacks by various figures outside trying to get the conference canceled, the university is held strong and will hold the conference despite all these attacks.
Okay, so I notice a little bit the difference between Harvard and Stanford in this respect. At least some open, multidisciplinary approaches are possible at Stanford, at least now. And at what point do you think is the debate in the United States considering the reappraisal of the corona measures? Like, for example, there is the select committee in the Congress. Sometimes we see videos here in Germany, but we don't really know at which point is the debate. So what would you say? Is there a reappraisal of what happened?
There is a... The United States is interesting because it's not really one culture. It's multiple cultures, and in particular, there's a very, very sharp political divide. So I think if you go to Florida, for instance, where the measures that were adopted were more in line with my advice, especially after May of 2020, schools stayed open. There was more emphasis on protecting vulnerable older people, getting treatments and access to services for older people. Focused protection. In Florida, they look at the measures that for instance California adopted, where schools closed as just crazy. Like, why on earth would you have to do that? And they're right to do that. The all-cause excess deaths are lower in Florida than they are in California. Mm-hmm. So you have this almost a political divide where the more conservative states believe that the measures that were adopted were nonsensical, in fact tyrannical. And in the more liberal states, the more progressive states like California, there's still a very substantial number of people who are absolutely convinced that the only reason why the COVID response failed was because of conservatives. So they essentially demonize conservatives, and they are very resistant to having an honest assessment, an honest discussion, or an honest scientific evaluation of the efficacy of the measures. Okay. So we're in a very funny place. You can see lots and lots of political leaders in the United States, especially from more conservative places, that have worked to get a reappraisal, but it's very difficult to get people together from both parts. The political divide to have an honest discussion about what happened. We still are missing that. Okay.
I thought that the select subcommittee would be a bipartisan endeavor, but it's more the Republicans which are engaged in this. Okay, I see. Yeah, it's a little bit comparable to Germany because only the opposition in Germany objects the measures, and the coalition, the traffic light coalition, which is in place, of course, doesn't want to talk about the corona measures. And how comes that you are so well informed about Germany? Like, when I see you on X, you're one of the persons that often shares the contributions of German COVID measure critics. So is it personal interest, or how comes that you follow these events here?
Well, I very firmly believe, and have through my entire career, that if I just pay attention to the United States, I will be ignorant. And so I try very hard, although I don't speak German, I wish I did. I try very hard to follow the literature and the debate and the discussions that are happening around the world for the kinds of topics I'm interested in. And certainly during COVID, that's paid off enormously. I mean, I learned about the Swedish response very early and tracked it very carefully as best I could. And the nice thing is that there are now these automatic translators, so I don't have to wait until somebody translates for me. Mm-hmm. The German response has fascinated me almost from the beginning, right?
Why?
I think that Germany played a tremendously important scientific role in virology and in epidemiology. Historically, for instance, the Robert Koch Institute, it's named after one of the giants of microbiology, right? So to me, the German role in science has been always very important for me to follow, especially in biology. It's been interesting, specifically with respect to COVID. I thought the contrast between the Swedish response and the German response was absolutely fascinating. Right, you have next door to you an example of a very, very different policy. So I was very curious to see how the German press and the scientific establishment were responding to the Swedish heresy, if you will. So I tracked that from the very beginning of the pandemic. And so when I was also the subject of some vitriol by German scientists that were advising the German government. Like specifically, Christian Drosten attacked me and Martin Kulldorff and Sunetra Gupta after we wrote the declaration. He still occasionally pokes me on Twitter for some reason. He seems very upset that there are people outside of in science that disagree with him about anything. So there was also like this personal thing, but even before the personal thing, I was very fascinated by the contrast between Sweden and Germany.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Right now, my colleague Bastian Baroka, who was with me at the press conference concerning the RKI files, he asked the RKI if there was a change between the two institutions, that of Anders Tegnell and the German one. And in fact, they had one discourse and changed ideas, and he's now trying to get more information out what Germany made out of these informations coming from Sweden, because obviously they didn't get inspired. Yeah. And do you think that the corona crisis or something similar like this could be repeated again?
I think there's a 100% chance of that happening. I think that because there has not yet been an honest evaluation of the COVID response. Just think about what happens after an airplane crashes. You normally would have investigators come, look at the physical evidence, the black box, and generally the idea isn't to blame anybody. The idea is to figure out what went wrong and then alter the systems so that they don't make that same mistake again. You don't get the same crash again in the future. Same thing after a patient dies in a hospital. Unnecessarily, you'll have a discussion among doctors and other medical personnel to try to understand what went wrong. It's usually again, it's not usually aimed at trying to point to blame, but to understand what systems features allowed the disaster to happen. We have not had that. And in fact, what's happened is that the people who impose the measures, the scientific parts of the scientific community that impose the measures, have done everything in their power to block a discussion around that. Mm-hmm. And the next time there's a pandemic, and there will be future pandemics, the template that we followed during the COVID pandemic for the lockdowns, the school closures, the business closures, the closures of houses of worship, the vaccine mandates, all of the rapid development of a vaccine with sort of relatively inadequate testing, the control of the information environment to make sure that there's no one opposing the government ideas. That is now the normal template for future management of pandemics. And until we explicitly reject it, I'm certain that it will come back.
Mm-hmm. And one could also argue, your stance is never again lockdown, but imagine a virus which is more mortal than corona, or imagine next time children are disproportionately more affected than this time. So as to pose a little bit as advocatus diaboli in this respect, what do you tell these people? Why should, in your eyes, a lockdown still be prohibited, or we still should not put the burden on children?
Yeah, I think the broader principle is not only protect the old, focus protection of the old, and let children do their thing. That's a result of the scientific facts about COVID, right? Mm-hmm. So COVID is a very low risk virus for children, much higher risk for old people. It induces immunity. So after you've had COVID, you have substantial immunity, so that the second or third or fourth time you get it, you'll have much less likely to go to the hospital or get very, very, very sick, right? So those are basic facts, epidemiological, biological facts about COVID. You have to design the response relative to the scientific facts about the virus itself. Mm-hmm. You have to design the response based on the social milieu in which the response is taking place, right? We have very, very unequal societies, right? Older people are much more likely older people are much more likely I'm sorry, poorer people are much more likely to not be able to live at home, without going to work. They lose their jobs. And so you have to design the strategy around the biological facts.
Yes.
So the next time there's a pandemic, you have to look at those biological facts and then design the strategy based on a few principles. So the principle is identify the high-risk group, whoever they are, and work to protect that group. Minimize the impact of the rest of society if it's possible. So if the high-risk group turns out to be children, then you have to do a response that protects children. You may close schools. You have to do a risk assessment so that you compare the actual benefits from the strategy you follow versus the certain costs. So if you're going to close schools, understand that you're going to be harming children. You better have offsetting benefits to children that warrant it. If the lockdowns themselves have a very narrow therapeutic window. So if you have a very, very high mortality disease, that's not enough for a lockdown, because you may not protect anybody with a lockdown, with a high mortality disease. Often the high mortality disease, people, they're very sick, they won't go out. You don't need to lock down. You don't need to do a global lockdown for Ebola, because people get very sick when they get Ebola, so they don't go out and infect many people. Local quarantines are enough. Right, so
you fear that next time the measures of this time will just be used as a template, regardless of what the next virus will be. Why do you think that the monkeypox did not work the same way as COVID, as an WHO public health emergency of international concern? Is it because of the transmission way, that it's not airborne, so you can't make this you are asymptomatic but you could be dangerous thing out of it?
I think that a respiratory virus, a virus that's transmitted via respiratory means, that has a asymptomatic period, really you need those two kinds of capacities for a virus to have the kind of effect that coronavirus had. The monkeypox, there was the outbreak of monkeypox in 2022, I think it was. But before that, monkeypox there'd been several outbreaks in the 2 decades before, that was primarily focused on I think it was like guinea pigs or something, small animals, that the people that were handling, it wasn't guinea pigs. I'm blanking on the animal. I apologize, but the point is that there were small animals, small mammals, exotic small mammals imported from Africa. And so in the United States, when monkeypox happened in 2002, 2003, I forget exactly the date, it happened in the handlers of those animals and then the pet owners. Mm-hmm. The 2022 monkeypox, the primary outbreak happened via like gay sex, basically, mm-hmm. right? That was the primary means of transmission. Mm-hmm. For monkeypox, there was already a vaccine available. And so, what they ended up doing for monkeypox was focused protection. Mm-hmm. They identified the high-risk groups and intervened with those groups with the best interventions that we had available, vaccines, as well as advice about how the transmission actually happened. Much more scientific, much more measured. It doesn't have the capacity to threaten the population at large, where everybody is potentially a carrier, right? That's the difference. With COVID, just think about what the ideology of the lockdown is. The ideology is that we are all mere biohazards. We are only biohazards, and we should treat each other as biohazards. Mm-hmm. That is the fundamental problem with the lockdown. If we think about each other that way, we will dehumanize each other. We will be scared of each other. We will adopt procedures and policies that have nothing to do with the science, because we act out of fear. And it turns out, even the very, very top people in science and in public health will act exactly in that way when they have adopted the idea that we're all mere biohazards. And I think it's diseases that have a long asymptomatic period, that are spread via via breathing that are the most likely to produce that kind of response. And the template is when we have a pathogen like that another time, and it will happen, we're going to have the same response.
You were first reluctant to sign the Hope Accord by Joseph Freeman because you argued there could be some groups for which the coronavirus mRNA vaccine could be useful. And obviously you changed your mind on this because you signed the petition, right? And
I did, yes.
What changed your mind on this?
So the Hope Accord, I think, was written just this year, right? By a group of doctors and scientists arguing that it's no longer necessary to suggest that the mRNA vaccine for COVID be used. In my mind, there's a lot of, even before I decided I wasn't going to sign, there's I think a lot of scientific warrant to say that for the vast majority of the population who've already had COVID and recovered, the additional mRNA vaccines are not producing very much benefit. Certainly, there's no randomized evidence that demonstrates this clinical benefit for the boosters that are currently out. There's small-scale studies of immune boosting, but not any large-scale studies demonstrating, for instance, prevention of hospitalization and death from the vaccines, from the new COVID vaccines that are out. But in my mind, I thought, well, I don't know for certain that there aren't some groups in the population who might still benefit. It's possible, right? I didn't want to sign the accord and say, well, we shouldn't explore at all whether some groups in the population. So, for instance, some older people, maybe some immunocompromised people. I don't know if the new boosters are of benefit to them or not because we haven't run a randomized trial. But if I sign an accord that says let's not use it, I thought, for anybody, then it might be that we wouldn't get the studies we need to determine if it would be useful. I did a discussion with my good friend Joe Fryman, who was one of the co-authors of the accord, on a podcast I run, and during that discussion debate, Joe made a very, very important and interesting point, which I hadn't thought of before, and that is that if you don't have something like the Hope Accord, what the governments are doing, what the regulatory authorities are doing, is saying everyone should take it without the evidence, including in the United States, kids as young as 6 months old. And so if my position is I want there to be scientific evidence to justify the recommendation, if we don't have something like the Hope Accord, it's very unlikely, in fact, certainly will not happen that we will get the kind of scientific studies that I want. Because the regulatory authorities are saying, yes, you can sell these things without having the studies that are important. And of course, why would the drug companies run studies when they don't need to convince the regulatory authorities? So that's why I changed my mind on the Hope Accord. I think it actually makes it more likely that we will get the kind of studies we need to establish whether or not these vaccines are still useful, 4 years on.
And what is your stance on the origin of COVID-19? I think I heard in another interview that you opt more for lab leak instead of natural zoonosis. I would agree on this, but could you describe a little bit how you see this?
Sure. I think it's very likely was a lab leak. The evidence for that is it's partly based on the scientific evidence on the molecular structure of the virus itself. I could go on to some technical details about furin cleavage sites and endonuclease site distributions and things like that. But I think that scientific evidence points very strongly toward a lab leak. That the kind of engineered virus that you would see wouldn't arise by natural evolution.
Yes.
But it's even more. But I don't think it's an open and shut case. I think that there's still room for doubt. I think there's some reasonable scientists on the other side who say, well, the molecular evidence by itself does not establish a lab leak. Right? I understand. I mean, I think that's true. I think it still points to it's like 80% likely that it's a lab leak just based on the molecular biology alone. to me, the key thing is there's two lines of non-molecular biological evidence that I think point to a lab leak. One is there was a long history of people, scientific authorities like Tony Fauci, like Christian Drosten, who participated in a research program that they justified of going out to the wild places, finding viruses in the wild, bringing them to labs and city centers, including in China, including the Wuhan lab, augmenting their capacity in order to see if they were likely to evolve into threats that would jump into humans. That was there was a big decades-long fight over this exact strategy, and the people like Tony Fauci and Christian Drosten supported this strategy over the objections of lots and lots of other scientists. And when the pandemic hit, people like Tony Fauci organized essentially a cover-up of the possibility of a lab leak. Right, so there's that piece of evidence. I think that this long history that suggests that you had a whole group of scientific leaders that had an incentive to suppress the possibility of a lab leak, because if they became widely understood there was a lab leak, their reputations would suffer.
Yeah, the narrative totally decides about their careers and their future. And what is interesting is that before 2020, lab leaks were even cited as reasons why gain-of-function research was necessary. But after 2020, they only pointed towards natural zoonoses. And that's why we need this kind of research. But of course, when you opt for natural zoonoses, then your gain-of-function research still has a long way to go, because it can protect us in the future, hopefully. And if you say lab leak, okay, maybe we just started the entire thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, just imagine that. I think if what I believe is true, then scientists caused the suffering that we went through the last 4 years. All of the measures would have been unnecessary had there not been this lab leak. It's the initiating event. Right. So for scientists, it's a major scandal. It's like Chernobyl, right? The nuclear accident in Russia. When there was the old Soviet Union. There was a massive event where the scientists that were in charge of the nuclear plant were quite irresponsible in the safety of it, and it led to, I mean, there's still radioactive problems in around that area, and it was a huge cloud of radioactive vapor that went all across Europe. If this actually is a scientist-caused pandemic, it's the worst scientist-caused industrial accident in history. Tens of millions of people harmed, countless lives disrupted. We absolutely need an answer. Let me give you the second line of evidence I was thinking of. There was a proposal put forward by a group called EcoHealth Alliance, which worked very closely with the Chinese lab where the virus very likely emerged. In 2018, they proposed some scientific work, including gain-of-function work, that looks, with bat coronaviruses, that look very much like the kind of work that would have led to the pandemic. And this group hid the existence of this proposal until it was leaked by some folks in the military, actually, who had access to it.
General Murphy.
So
I know. DARPA diffuse.
Yes. So the diffuse, called the diffuse proposal, right? So you have these like incentives to hide this work. You have the molecular biological evidence, and then the third leg of this, actually, as I think about it, is the Chinese incentive to hide that it's possible lab leak, right? So this is not purely a scientific question. It's essentially a criminal investigation. Right? You want to apply the standards of evidence you apply, because you have people who have an incentive to hide their culpability. You have in effect a weapon, right? You have this virus, a weapon in the analogical sense. I think it wasn't a bioweapon specifically. I think it was a leak. So in order, and you have you can't just simply take the word of the Chinese scientists and say, oh, we didn't do anything wrong, or the Chinese government, we didn't do anything wrong. You can't take the word of Tony Fauci to say we didn't do anything wrong. You have to try to understand what their motives were, what the evidence was, what evidence they didn't want to get out. It has the kind of feel of a forensics investigation rather than a straight scientific question. And on the basis of that, I think it's very, very, very likely, much more than 80%, that it was a lab leak that caused this pandemic.
Do you think that the early embrace of lockdowns could be related to the fact that fears of a lab-originated virus with completely unpredictable properties could have nudged state leaders into embracing these harsh measures?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, just imagine, put yourself in the shoes of Tony Fauci, right? In 2012, you wrote a paper where you argued in favor of this whole, let's go find viruses in the wild and augment their capacities. That's the way to prevent viruses, right? And then you write in this paper that even if this research causes a pandemic, it will still have been worth it.
Crazy.
That's in 2012. You published this paper. You must feel tremendously guilty when the first you hear that there might be that there's this new outbreak exactly in the lab that you funded, on the kind of work that you funded, right? And so it's like you've opened Pandora's box. And of course, you're going to want to do everything you can to close it, even crazy things, even harmful things, because every COVID death hurts you. It hurts your reputation. The harm to children, the demolishment of the working class, the economic devastation leading to starvation at scale, none of that hurts you. You're only responsible for COVID deaths. The leaders like Francis Collins and Tony Fauci still say that, right? They're not responsible for all the collateral harms of the lockdowns. Their only job was to protect COVID. Why would they want that? I mean, they're in public health. They should care about public health more broadly, not just COVID. But if they're partly responsible for the pandemic itself, they open Pandora's box. Their embrace of lockdowns, how could it not have been partly psychologically driven by the sense of guilt?
And you posted on X something interesting yesterday. What high-quality evidence did the WHO rely on to push lockdowns and social distancing? What high-quality evidence did Jeremy Farrar rely on to fund dangerous work that likely caused the pandemic? And that leads me to the role of Jeremy Farrar in this. So he also funded this, obviously, this kind of work, you think. But you asked about the role of the WHO. Do you really think that only a new leadership of the WHO would do it? Like change Tedros for another puppet or another functional? I'm not totally naive. I do think that if it was just new leadership chosen by the same process, you would have same problems. I think the private funding of the WHO is a major problem. The private funding structure, it led to people like Jeremy Farrar having the position they have. The Gates Foundation funding, a whole bunch of other funding sources that the WHO then ends up representing interests that it shouldn't represent. I do believe a body like the WHO is a necessary thing and can be quite useful and helpful for the health of world populations if it functions properly, if it has the right incentives. For that, we're going to need a change in the funding structure and we're going to need a change in the leadership. The idea that Jeremy Farrar, who was the head of the Wellcome Trust in the UK before the pandemic and who funded gain-of-function work, should become and then was a big proponent of the lockdown strategy. That the idea that he should become the chief scientific officer of the WHO undermines I think, in my mind, the trustworthiness of the WHO. The WHO job is to represent the whole world in their health advice, right? So when the pandemic hit, they should have been thinking very carefully about their pushing of the lockdown strategies. They absolutely did, although they tried to deny it. They panicked the world. They put forward people like Neil Ferguson and his Imperial College model, and they underplayed the damage
that would happen from economic harms of the lockdowns to the well-being of the poor. The UN put a report out in counterpoint to the WHO saying that in April of 2020, they put out a report saying that 130 million people would face starvation as a consequence of the lockdowns. WHO should have been putting that report out. They should have been pushing balanced reasoning about the impact of the lockdowns rather than the panic mongering they did. And so they failed at their fundamental job, which is to represent to the world the interests of even the poorest people in the world in the health decisions the world makes. And so I think that to me is the reason why I put that tweet there. There was no evidence that they really embraced that showed that lockdowns were certainly going to work. There was none. There was just very, very loose reasoning around mathematical models that bore no resemblance to reality.
Mm-hmm. And they even priced China's response to COVID before China's response to COVID could show any results. So they basically praised human rights abuses without any positive results to be seen.
It was very flimsy. So they sent a in February 2020, they sent a delegation to China and visited with a few of the top Chinese authorities who told them that the lockdowns had worked, and they came home from the WHO came home. This delegation came home saying the lockdowns had worked and told the world governments that they needed to lock down, essentially to copy the Chinese response. Mm-hmm. The flimsiest of evidence. And there was a lot of desire not to offend the Chinese authorities, implicit in the WHO's advice. Again, the WHO is supposed to represent all the nations. The sensitivities of one single nation, especially a nation where the virus first emerges, and that you can tell that they in 2003 during the first SARS pandemic, China hid the emergence of that. They have a history of hiding it. Back then, the WHO essentially overrode the Chinese authorities and told the world that this new virus, SARS-1, had emerged. During the pandemic, especially the early days of the pandemic, the WHO essentially was a cat's paw of the Chinese government and a cat's paw of the people who had funded the gain of function work that very likely caused the pandemic. And they've rewarded them by making people like Jeremy Farrar the chief scientific officer.
Mm-hmm. And some people argue that Corona was just like the flu. Many critics of the Corona measures in Germany say that. I think you don't belong to this angle of people. Me neither. And I think you would agree that it had distinct features, which made it more dangerous a little bit for some people. And how would you describe Corona compared to the flu? And what happened to the flu? Because the flu kind of vanished during the Corona years and then it came back. So what happened out there in reality?
Right. So it's obviously it's caused by a coronavirus, not an influenza virus. So just in that sense, it's not the flu. It also has distinct, I think, features, epidemiological features from the flu, right? So the flu does have this age gradient in risk, but the age gradient is much steeper for COVID, right? It's actually more than 1,000-fold difference in the risk of mortality from the oldest to the youngest. And so that's very important. I think it spreads more easily than the flu, although the flu does spread quite easily. So I think that's also true. It does spread in a similar way than the flu, as the flu does, right? Via respiratory droplets and by aerosolization events. So I think that those two things are important. It doesn't seem to have exactly the seasonal characteristics of the flu. Arrives in a very, very particular seasonal way, and COVID, maybe because it hasn't yet fully settled down into equilibrium, you get a winter wave and you get a summer wave, right? That seems a little bit different than the flu. So the epidemiological characteristics is not quite the flu, but there's enough similarities that I can understand why some people would say it was very similar. Mm-hmm. Of course, the mortality rate was much higher than the flu in the early days of the pandemic. The most important difference between the flu and the coronavirus from 2020 was that the population, the world population, had some degree of immunity to the flu. for year after year, we've been exposed to the flu. There's been, vaccinations for the flu. When the flu arrives, it's not impacting an immune naive population. We have some immunity to the flu. In large part, the coronavirus, when it arrived, it impacted a population that had not seen a very, very similar virus before. There was some cross immunity, but for the most part, not all that protective. And so that's the biggest difference between the flu is not the particulars of the molecular biology or even the epidemiology. The key thing is that it arrived and impacted an immune naive population in 2020. As a result, it caused tremendous damage compared to what a typical flu season would cause. The question of how much damage it was going to cause was a scientific question to be answered rather than assumed. But yeah, so that's why I tend to stay away from it's exactly like the flu. It's not. You asked how the flu disappeared. During the pandemic, I've seen two reasonable conjectures about that. I don't know that we know that for a fact, but it is a very striking fact that after coronavirus started spread around the world starting March 2020, the level of the flu, the prevalence of the flu dropped to where there's almost no flu spread at all in 2020 and 2021. An absolutely striking fact. And some people have said, oh well, because the PCR test, the test for the coronavirus, the flu virus tests mistakenly identified the coronavirus. But I don't think that's plausible. I don't think that's true. Because you have a very distinct test for the flu that's very specific to the flu. So it's not the flu test is never going to show up as a coronavirus, a positive for coronavirus. It doesn't make any biological sense. So that's one theory. So I don't think that theory is right. The second theory is that there's interference, competition in the nose between respiratory viruses. And for whatever reason, COVID won out for 2 years. I thought that theory had some plausibility for a while, but then I saw some scientific papers that suggest that that's not true, actually, that there isn't this kind of competition in the nose, and you can actually get both grow in cells together. I mean, it's possible. Again, I'm not denying that that's still a possible thing, but I think it's less likely than in 2021, if you'd asked me, I would have thought that was much more likely. I no longer believe that that's the likely explanation. The third explanation, which I've seen, I think is the likely one. Imagine a population that has lots and lots of immunity to the flu, because we've seen it before. We've had flu vaccines and so on, but no immunity to COVID. And you do a lockdown. The lockdown, what it does is it reduces the herd immunity threshold. Herd immunity threshold means what fraction of the population must have immunity so that the disease no longer spread. The lockdown reduces the threshold, the herd immunity threshold for the flu, so that the level of immunity of the flu, while it was like really close before, now is above, the immunity of the flu is above the herd immunity threshold for the flu. And now that means that the flu will stop spreading. We artificially, by the lockdown, suppressing the herd immunity threshold. But for COVID, let's say that the herd immunity threshold is up here and the population immunity is down here. You do a lockdown, you still are going to get a lot of COVID spread because almost nobody has immunity. And so I think that the key thing, I think the real reason why the flu disappeared was that the lockdowns that the lockdowns impacted the equilibrium level of the flu, so that the herd immunity threshold went below the immunity level until the lockdowns went away, and then the immunity for the flu also started to wane, and so then the flu came back when that was the case. The key reason why the lockdowns didn't get rid of COVID was that we were very far out of equilibrium. The disease spreads very, very easily. There was no immunity, and the lockdown did nothing actually for the ultimate spread. The long run is, and we may even be close to the long run, is that there's an equilibrium level of the flu, an equilibrium level of COVID that spreads forever in populations because we have no technology to get rid of them.
Yes, I think so too. And a little bit of fun question to finish. My friend and colleague Bastian Baroka asked me to ask you if there is an association for fringe epidemiologists and where one can join.
My friend Daniel Wirt sent me a T-shirt where he printed out the International Association of Fringe Epidemiology. There's no formal organization, but anyone wants to join, just DM me on Twitter, and I will happily grant you the official membership in my little club of fringe epidemiologists.
Yeah, so cool. Yeah, thank you so much for your work. I think you were, for me, really a hopeful moment of light during these years, and I think you were just right. And I think it gave hope to a lot of people that scientists dared to speak out and dared to speak their mind about what they thought was right, and it gave a very important corrective at very dark times. And it kind of relieves me also that people like you with such a high reputation had to encounter the same destiny as all people who argued critique during this time. So, because then I know it's not because people did something wrong, like people like me did something wrong, because there were people like you, and still you were criticized as if you would be a granny killer. So it must have been something bigger going around, so that nobody was really immune to this kind of critique.
Well, I'm grateful to you also for the work you've done. I've learned a lot from your journalistic work, and I'm grateful to you for the chance to talk with you. Thank you for the kind words. Scientists need to speak up next time. I mean, that's at least a minimum. We have to say our minds, and we can't let governments suppress our ability to speak.
You're right, and thank you very much.
Take care.